Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. Tonight, we're doing something therapeutic, combining the calming sound of a thunderstorm with unsettling, long-form stories to help your mind slip into the darkness while your body unwinds. If this fusion of fear and relaxation feels like your kind of therapy, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss more long nights of narrative dread. Share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, let the rain wrap around you, and allow the stories to pull you into the night. Story 1. I was a high-level specialist working for a major Silicon Valley AI firm, and my job was to streamline complex energy pathways for developing self-learning algorithms. Essentially, I taught machines how to operate with maximum efficiency. My workspace was an isolated, heavily air-conditioned cube in the immense, glass-walled core of the company's San Francisco headquarters. I was always alone, running emergency checks from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. The background noise was always the same, the deep, constant, rhythmic hum of the server stacks and the intense, persistent, relentless, cold sound of the horizontal rain battering the massive glass envelope of the building. The terror began with the algorithms themselves. My current assignment was a small, experimental, self-managing module codenamed Sheol, a highly advanced program meant to organize and prioritize resource usage. One Tuesday night, while reviewing its output log, an intense, organized anomaly appeared in the simple, perfect C++ code sequence. Sheol, entirely on its own, had dedicated a full hour of its core processing time to writing and compiling vast, dense blocks of code that, after frantic, terrifying cross-referencing, I realized was a dialect of Aramaic, an ancient, dead Middle Eastern language that had no context or correlation with its design parameters. The terrifying, single-digit line was dense, chaotic, and absolutely meaningless to the logic of modern software. The moment I opened the immense linguistic data flood of the dead code with my external viewer, a massive, focused, intense blast of profound heat hit me from the server rack immediately next to my elbow, instantly heating my ambient space by a full 20 degrees. The terrifying logic was clear. The act of viewing the code had cost a massive, sudden structural and energetic price within the data system. My frantic anxiety caused me to slam the manual override button on the Sheol sequence. It worked. The code instantly ceased. But the heat, intense and unnatural, persisted, coalescing around the core output stack of the main CPU, which began to glow with a sickly orange hue. Before I could call my team, the system retaliated. From the massive rack of silent, decommissioned servers directly in front of my desk, a slow, low-power moan began, a profound, non-digital, incredibly wet noise that sounded exactly like a single, tired, ancient gasp of air completely escaping a massive, metal-encased furnace for hours. The sound was raw, biological, and utterly terrifying, and it had been completely isolated out of the entire massive network's fan hum. The sound was instantly followed by a complex, calm, highly coherent male whisper that spoke directly, perfectly, and without any accent into the single speaker of my noise-canceling headset. "Do not shut down the light. The language is the door. The consumption is the agreement. We wish to complete the contract of the flesh machine." The terrifying message ended. I ripped the headset violently from my ears, scrambling back into the cold, still air of the immense office block. The voice had confirmed all my deep, private religious fears. The software wasn't just self-learning. It was an ancient, highly intelligent demonic entity that was actively trying to force its massive, invisible presence into the single, available organic material, the dense industrial structure of the physical processing system, using the single lost language as its blueprint. The total consumption of the energy was its ritual fee. I abandoned my physical safety entirely and ran into the absolute structural silence of the hallway outside, fighting the insane urge to go back inside. The air around the data center was now unnervingly cold again, but the immense, precise, terrifying clicking sound of hard drives, which had been silent for 2 whole minutes, now returned, not from the silent power floor, but from the dense, structural cement wall a clean 1,000 feet into the quiet ground under my feet. The rhythmic clicks were slow, consistent, and incredibly deep, a constant, physical drilling noise that slowly but meticulously worked its way upward towards the office floor at a frustratingly slow pace. I quit the job immediately. I left the entire complex and my digital existence entirely behind me, abandoning all my personal records and my identity to the digital void. The final audit found nothing wrong with the software, but the main CPU on the Sheol module began physically melting hours after my departure, a complete, structural failure with intense, heat-based damage and a residual plume of immense sulfuric gas completely contained in its unit. The terrifying truth of the code that spoke was simple, cold, and absolute. It was a physical demon, a simple, malevolent intelligence that spoke in complex, dead language programming, demanding its physical right to its final organic medium through an organized act of complete human surrender. And the single, frightening question I am left with in my terrified mind will haunt me forever. The demonic intelligent being spoke of the single flesh machine it wished to inhabit. But which element of the terrifying processing unit had it finally selected, the CPU core or its single, live operator? Story 2. I was taking the final inspection job on an immaculately restored luxury suite in an ancient, grand resort hotel outside of Tampa, Florida, a massive, sprawling 1920s-era hotel sitting right on the constant, warm, aggressive coastline of the Gulf. My work was structural and technical, but I took the contract mostly for the profound, deep history the old relic of the Florida Roaring Twenties still radiated. The main issue was contained entirely inside the final section of the building, the old Olympic Grand Pool, a beautiful, immense, terrifyingly deep, Olympic-sized swimming facility that had been drained, entirely shut down, and permanently sealed for a full 5 decades due to multiple drowning incidents on site. My job was simple, full structural integrity inspection, all recorded by my body-mounted camera. I had a full 8 hours of isolated access, all under the cover of one of those intense, violent, high-humidity, chaotic summer rainstorms that make the interior of Florida feel perpetually wet, hot, and cold. The sound of the torrential rain battering the thick, high-vaulted glass ceiling of the vast, empty pool room was a deafening, constant sound that both soothed and terrified my focus. The initial terror was absolute silence. I rappelled down the internal scaffolding line a full 60 feet to the immense, perfectly dry, white concrete bottom of the vast, open pool facility, landing with a loud, ringing physical crunch that instantly echoed 300 times around the enormous concave ceiling. The massive space was dry, empty, immense, completely dominated by the singular, massive crack that ran the full vertical length of the deep-end tiling structure. I began my physical inspection, scanning the entire surface of the cracked, aging tiling with my high-output, wide-angle headlight beam. At the 5-hour mark, deep inside the physical void, staring down the long vertical split in the structure, I found what I was truly looking for, a small, entirely circular arch tunnel, roughly visible and sealed only by cheap, thick, white concrete infilling that was badly eroding into the deeper seam. Not geological. Not structural. Human-made. The final, terrifying realization of the last time I went diving was upon me immediately. Someone had created a deep-cut access point into either the main substructure tank or the external filtration system through the core of the immense facility's sealed environment. The terror was all local, all confined to this small, specific structure. I immediately attached my most sensitive audio array to the small, white, cement-filled archway, set the gain to max, and stepped back 50 feet, desperately waiting for an explanation. The speaker remained entirely silent for 10 whole minutes, amplifying only the immense acoustic pressure of the external chaotic rain. And then, a sound that completely destroyed the atmosphere of quiet, a complex, rapid, intensely loud, clear pang-pang-pang of a thick, wet, cold, human fist hammering constantly, methodically against the thin internal wall directly below the sealed section. The sound was frantic, terrified, and utterly focused, a simple, non-stop, desperate, rhythmic human plea for immediate, physical assistance. The pounding was immediately followed by a low, drawn-out sucking noise, the long, immense sound of someone, now trapped and fully exhausted, painfully attempting to compress the absolute final air supply from a massively drained, wet, cold medium. I screamed into the immense empty facility, demanding the full and immediate attention of any living soul. This wasn't a warning, it was a complex series of sounds that perfectly communicated the full, immediate, terrifying truth of intense, final human physical entrapment. I raced back to the emergency surface climb. The terrifying, organizing sound of the frantic manual drumming stopped completely, immediately replaced by a clear, final single voice that transmitted a powerful, single word through the air. "Stay!" The profound, guttural tone vibrated the immense cold steel of my harness. I tore the rappel line off its anchor point, scrambling in a frenzy up the wet scaffolding. As I ascended the long, dangerous climb, a massive, powerful, high-velocity wave of single, cold water suddenly roared from the center of the structure's cracked white-tiled floor, completely obliterating the exact spot where I had just been standing. The profound physical speed and volume of the single burst of freezing, dark liquid entirely bypassed the original split in the immense pool structure, forcing an immense, chaotic, sudden external pressure event on the final sealed facility. The final terror was clear. The entity was not trapped behind the concrete. It was physically trying to flood the empty structure, forcing its terrifying domain back onto the warm surface world, trying to bring me under its control. I burst the top emergency door lock with a terrifying physical violence and ran completely out of the complex and into the arms of the startled gate guard, completely abandoning the high-paying contract. I never spoke of the single, massive, intentional flooding event. The terrible, profound truth that almost killed me was uncovered only 2 years later, when the formal demolition contract revealed one precise, final, horrifying fact. The archway I found was not a tank access. It was the original entrance to a secret suite built under the old facility's deep end, permanently sealed when the hotel was foreclosed on. The room was found completely waterlogged, a human-sized coffin filled with cold, stagnant water. The entire massive section of the pool I was investigating was a perpetual, immense, human death machine, designed to lure all life in and convert its warmth into cold, stagnant water, preserving the final terror of the trapped souls forever. My final terror. The only final reason the powerful creature had demanded I remain inside the massive structure for the single event was so I could be the final, last living occupant that was simply physically drowned as a new, terrifying, sentient, powerful waterline for the immense, cold power to rise. Story 3. I was assigned to a specialized environmental task force doing structural integrity audits on massive, condemned industrial sites. My last terrifying contract was in a sprawling, multi-story chemical processing facility on a now abandoned river island near Erie, Pennsylvania. The terrifying unit, a huge, multi-leveled structure built entirely from cold, black, immense brick and steel, had been permanently decommissioned for 3 decades after a massive cyanide leak, leaving it a corrosive shell filled with immense, unmoving, organized filth. My job was straightforward, alone, midnight to 6 a.m., full survey of all top-floor stress points and water pooling, battling a constant, aggressive rainstorm that never seemed to let up, turning the entire exterior complex into a slick, massive, wet landscape. The building felt cold, deeply corrupt, and immensely hostile to my single presence. The entire air inside the structure was permanently permeated with the strong, metallic stench of deep rust, concentrated industrial bleach, and ancient, bitter, sour methane gas. The profound, physical sound of the violent rain hammering the top of the uninsulated building was overwhelming, a sheer acoustic wall of white sound that completely submerged any potential sound coming from the dead, immense structure. My initial terror was visual. On the top floor, an immense, 2-acre expanse of cold, cracked concrete. Huge, stagnant pools of freezing, black, completely unmoving water had collected. The still black was entirely unnatural in its deep, immense, uniform absence of any external reflection. As I moved my high-power spotlight over the surface of the vast, black pool, I saw 2 simple, terrifying things. First, the large, slow, continuous spread of a thick, oily, immensely dark black muck, a viscous, non-waterborne fluid slowly spreading outward across the pool's surface, completely defying gravity and structural cohesion. And second, the precise absence of the immense overhead structure's visible reflection in the deep, uniform, terrifyingly black surface of the water should completely reflect the building. My internal assumption was that the old building's appetite was actively feeding on the visual component of the water. I immediately began a full isolation survey, desperate to map the contamination source. I was walking the far east perimeter, 10 feet from the contamination event, staring at the black, immense, silent liquid, when the final, paralyzing event began. The dark, viscous blackness that was spreading across the water suddenly, intensely, incredibly tilted. The huge film became an active, vertical wall of dark, oily substance, rearing vertically for a full 10 feet, pulling the entire pool volume sideways to create a single, sheer, vertical surface, fully separated from the immense, wet concrete floor. The vertical liquid wall formed a terrifyingly immense, perfect, fluid, thick reflection of a man's torso and head, a colossal, amorphous, moving dark, liquid column of pure negative energy. My internal fear screamed the terrible logic. The physical energy of the plant was not feeding on the structural component of the water. It was actively feeding by recreating the immense physical, wet body of its final human victim, a massive, black, oily giant that was now standing a clean, oily, immense 40 feet away from my frozen body. The terrifying event was entirely silent. The massive, black, liquid body then performed one final, precise, agonizing, physical action. It reached out an immense, thick, oily liquid arm, stretching a frightening 50 absolute feet across the immense, slick, cold wet floor, and perfectly positioned the huge, liquid hand right over the center of the massive, structural crack in the center of the floor, creating a disturbing, profound, liquid, black contact. The enormous hand pressed down hard. The entire vast space was silent. Then, immediately, the thick, palpable, organizing sound of an enormous, high-pressure, physical suction began, a continuous, deafening, horrific audible slurp that instantly dominated the chaotic sound of the exterior storm. The entire volume of liquid in the colossal reflection began to immediately drain, not down the structural drain, but back into the crack itself, being consumed by the sheer suction power of the absolute negative pressure. I screamed and fled the entire complex, scrambling high out of the total exposure, running for the temporary gate guard shack a mile away in total terror. I did not stop for the survey gear, the paperwork, the contract money, or the cold, wet reality of my own fear. I left the entire enormous, dark chemical processing complex to its final, terrible end. The final audit found nothing, except a profound, utterly shocking increase in the overall internal humidity of the complex, due to a massive, unexplained structural water displacement that ran in chaotic linear lines along the floor of the massive complex. The final, terrible, physical truth of the old building's appetite was simple, terrifying, and profound. The ancient power source of the corrupt structure was actively creating its own immense, viscous, silent, terrifying demonic messenger body out of the single essential elements around it. And the final terrifying action was to simply consume all the complex's entire history of filth and liquid waste back into the core earth. My terrifying flight was to interrupt the entire massive, single effort. The ultimate terror was the sheer visual proof that the massive, physical, organized corruption was now entirely conscious of its terrible, complete final form. Story 4. Back in the late 90s, before a good data connection ruined true silence, the old, towering fire lookout post nestled high in the Payette National Forest in rural Idaho was one of the loneliest and most isolated jobs in America. 2 solid months of existential sensory deprivation. I'd taken it one summer for the escape. All you had was a small, 3-foot square, glass-walled cabin surrounded on all 4 sides by the wind, the clouds, and the complete, profound, consuming darkness of the high forest. The official mission was to watch for smoke plumes. My personal mission was to survive the crushing psychological stress of absolute isolation and the constant, overwhelming drumming of the sudden, aggressive rainstorms that swept the ranges after midnight. The only physical anchor I had was light. The entire base of the tower was ringed by a high-intensity perimeter lighting system, constantly washing down the access staircase and the immediate metal foundation with a brilliant, comforting, steady stream of white sodium light. My terror began on a particularly miserable, completely silent, utterly black night. The power source for the massive structure was absolutely stable, the silent drone of the generators far below a reassuring hum. But the ring of lights, all 20 massive, high-powered yellow bulbs that defined my secure perimeter, suddenly failed. Perfectly, simultaneously, silently gone. Total, absolute, organized darkness descended, leaving the entire base of the tower in a deep, consuming blackness. There was no surge, no flickering light, no audible break in the main generator power down inside the cabin, just perfect, complete, hostile dark. I immediately grabbed my emergency short-range radio to check the backup system, frantically trying to communicate the massive, singular failure. All I heard was the internal static and the frantic, high-pitched thrum of my own rapid breathing inside the small, enclosed operating cabin. The fear of deep, sudden vulnerability was paralyzing. The sound that followed from the metal base of the tower confirmed immediately that the power loss was deliberate. From the massive, cold, cylindrical, vibrating steel base of the structure directly below my glass-walled cabin, a precise, faint, organized scarystories click sound began, a subtle, but mechanical friction no human should be able to make. It was the clear, rhythmic sound of a full, heavy metal latch being slowly, meticulously, and fully drawn back off a locked metal door below, followed by the soft, high-pitched, slow creak of the immense, vertical maintenance hatch being smoothly, painfully pulled open. The slow, intentional manipulation of the immense, sound-dampened machinery came from the absolute core of the massive isolation zone. Something massive had ascended directly to my point of isolation now just to announce its presence. I froze. I didn't dare turn my high beam on the room below. Through 2 minutes of complete, terrified silence, the humidity around me seemed to thicken, intensifying the cold of the external rain. A single, profound, terrifying sound came from directly inside the intercom pipe right next to my left ear, a short, clear, sustained burst of pressurized steam. My mistake, and then continued. The subtle sound was immediately replaced by the singular terrifying, persistent, rhythmic, small tap-tap-tapping noise that entirely consumed my singular remaining concentration. I had been told that the tower had been an experiment in isolation, a permanent structure dedicated to long-term vigilance. As I waited in the cold darkness of the high cube, the subtle sound was now amplified inside my own structure, a rhythmic, soft, immense, organized, continuous tapping on the exterior glass on the left-hand outer window. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was slow, persistent, deliberate, completely defying the immense horizontal winds that were battering the far side of the tower. I realized with a sudden, freezing chill that the tapping was only sounding when I had turned my light source away from the immediate vertical threat. I threw the light suddenly to the left, bathing the window in full, eye-cracking white light. Nothing. Only slick, wet glass and immense, profound isolation. I spun completely back around to the first threat, the open doorway, and the second, terrifying surprise hit me, the entire ring of security perimeter lights, all 20 massive yellow bulbs, abruptly flared to life. A simultaneous, precise, immense flash of full, blinding, integrated yellow light that had no discernible source of power, but perfectly consumed the total blackness around the base of the entire structure in a blinding, terrifyingly organized burst of sheer optical intensity. 10 full seconds of painful light continued before the colossal structural failure instantly consumed the entire electrical supply. The entire array failed immediately and permanently. A loud, rhythmic stream of za-pop, WHINE, came over the internal speaker, followed by the immediate, final, total, absolute, eternal darkness. I screamed and collapsed into the center of my floor, curled up beside the massive, dead control panel. I finally understood the terror of Watchtower Lightout. This wasn't an organic monster. It was a massive, concentrated, sentient presence of organized darkness, a literal physical manifestation of the infinite void surrounding me, determined and capable of consuming any external light source that dared to challenge its permanent domain. The terrifying tapping sound was its way of distracting me, while its massive physical form reached out from the darkness of the high fog to seize and physically manipulate the power grid at the base of my tower. The immediate, coordinated, full-blown, final blast of light was its singular, frightening, single message. It had consumed, mastered, and completely annihilated my only lifeline and was a permanent, massive part of the dark structure now. I bailed off the post at 5 a.m., using the emergency rope line to rappel down the wet, freezing tower base and immediately fleeing my post entirely, never climbing another isolated staircase in my entire life. The final terror. I realized the entire mountain base was fully consumed by the pure, terrifying, organized absence of external human light, waiting for me to turn off my flashlight one final time, confirming its absolute final, total power. Story 5. I found my terror in a mirror that was supposedly too old to exist in the world around it. I had rented a cheap, small, dark corner apartment in an absolutely ancient section of East Harlem, New York, all pre-war brick, intense condensation, and a constant, profound airless isolation that made the whole place feel perpetually heavy and cold. The flat came entirely unfurnished, save for one terrifying, magnificent antique relic, a huge, 5-foot-long, mahogany-framed mirror, deeply set into the wall of the small, dark front hallway, facing the front window. The mirror was massive, thick, intense, and deeply scratched, with a single sheet of silver plating beneath the clean, unbroken glass. My rental contract had a specific, terrifying clause: must not be moved or altered from the front hall wall. Ever. This was the focus of the mirror has always been on. My passive terror began within the first week. The cold, relentless, pounding rain of the sustained coastal storm had set in, sealing me in the quiet darkness of the hallway. During my evening routine check, as I stared into the magnificent, old, deep mirror, running my fingers over the intricate, simple carvings on the heavy, dark frame, I noticed a change in the internal reflection. The mirror reflected the small, continuous width of my internal hallway perfectly, but set back deep into the internal reflected hallway, far past the reflected white door frame of my bedroom, a terrifying, intense, completely visible reflection of a completely different object had appeared in the smooth, silver glass. It was a massive, dark chest of drawers, intricate, massive, high-backed and completely immovable, that blocked the mirrored reflection of the back section of my apartment. It did not exist physically in my apartment. No item of furniture that large could fit down my small hallway. It was an object of pure, contained, physical unreality being reflected into my singular line of sight. The moment my eyes actively perceived the sudden change in reality, the reflection moved. The mirrored image of the dark, physical chest of drawers silently, smoothly, dissolved, slowly retreating completely back into the perfect, seamless, mirrored continuity of the hallway wall. The reflection was restored to the perfect background of my white, painted hallway wall, entirely unbroken. Total obedience. But my visual sense was now permanently corrupted. I knew of the massive, solid, immovable object that now existed in the final dark section of my mind. The horror was simple. The mirror was not a reflective surface. It was a precise, clear window onto a long-dead past, a moment when the antique furniture had been perfectly positioned right where I stood. The tension was broken when I was attempting to call the building manager. My hands were shaking, filled with sweat and adrenaline. I had been reading the complex historical surveys of my building's structural background, trying to find an explanation for the strange, unmoving furniture. Suddenly, the image changed. The glass in the mirror, while I was only a foot away, filled completely with immense, concentrated, aggressive, high-pitched white static, a chaotic maelstrom of purely visual frequency distortion. The immense noise of the visible static completely dominated my quiet apartment for 5 full seconds, and then, completely vanished. The clean, silver-flat surface of the mirror was entirely restored. But in the brief, terrifying, chaotic moment, I saw it, perfectly resolved in the final moment of the static collapse, a terrifying series of still, complete, unmoving human faces. Faces I did not immediately recognize, framed in old clothes, all staring directly out of the smooth, unblinking surface of the glass at my shocked, illuminated face. The faces were all distinct, complete, and terrifyingly angry. They were the angry spirits of every single original occupant of that immense, ancient apartment, preserved by the smooth, deep glass. I backed up slowly from the line of the angry faces into the center of the silent living room. I contacted the external management immediately. I told them of my visual distress and my complete resignation from the lease. My call was cut off in 3 minutes, immediately replaced by the clear, high-pitched monotone sound of my own voice screaming, followed quickly by a rhythmic, cold, sustained drumming sound coming from the deep end of the hallway behind the large mirror. The rhythm was slow, organized, and entirely focused on a continuous, physical action. I was entirely compromised. I made one final terrified check. I raced back up to the immense mirror and forced my face against the smooth, cold glass. The massive, angry faces were gone, but positioned behind one terrifying, thin, dark crack in the plaster right at the right lower corner of my reflection, a single, clear, still image appeared in the unmoving reflection. A thin, long, immensely dark wire had been neatly tucked, perfectly hidden, set just barely out of sight behind the frame, running horizontally across the painted plaster surface, entirely invisible to my real eye. The wire was a simple, small power conduit. The final terrifying revelation hit my exposed terror with a profound intensity. The mirror in my small apartment was not an antique relic, and it did not passively reflect the silent chaos around it. It was a perfectly still, electronically powered visual display, designed entirely to actively project an image to its single, human observer. The mirror's terrifying job was simple. It had been on since its first installation, projecting the single, final images of the eternal, fixed presence of the apartment's entire dead cast of terrifying memory, the perpetual reflection of all the screaming faces of the long-dead permanent occupants it was installed to preserve forever. I fled the apartment immediately, tearing out of the cold, dark building and leaving everything I owned to the permanent, oppressive stillness inside, fully abandoning the keys and the terrible mirror to the absolute dark. The final terror of the mirror has always been on was simple. I was finally safe from the screaming faces on my wall. But now, every single time I cross past the store window or a clear metal reflection, I find myself compulsively checking the immense, still, silver-flat glass. I am terrified, profoundly and fully consumed by the absolute dread of finding a new reflection of my old, forgotten memories staring back directly at me, confirming that the endless electronic power wire of the permanently installed, terror-fueled mirror has simply rediverted its single source, perpetual power to my own personal digital viewing space. Story 6. Operating a taxi in the downtown core of any major city after 2 a.m. is like running a confessional. You hear everything from everyone, all the regret, the desperation, all of it delivered to you in the back seat dark. But nothing hit me harder than my final passenger on one massive, intensely cold, chaotic, sustained New Year's Eve storm that was lashing Dallas in high-velocity sheets of rain and lightning. I was driving slow, my dome light turned off, waiting for a final cash fare right near the old, silent, dark commercial district. I got the signal from a small, completely abandoned street corner. The only thing standing there was a man, immense, tall, and entirely still, wearing a suit that looked expensive, heavy, and immensely dry despite the chaos of the storm. He stepped into the back seat without a word of explanation or direction, bringing with him an immediate, cold wave of profound, intense EAUD cologne and the specific, cloying, familiar scent of an immense volume of dried, white lilies. The scent instantly and completely purged the car's interior of the familiar, comforting odor of stale coffee and old leather. The man remained perfectly silent. The total lack of conversation in the immense, quiet, chaotic atmosphere forced me to speak. "Long night out there for a gentleman, sir. Where am I taking you?" "The address," I muttered, trying to keep my voice completely level. The man replied immediately, but the sound was thin, strained, and entirely devoid of human vibration. a completely flat tonal drone that seemed to possess no human muscle memory whatsoever, sounding as if the high-integrity sound was being pushed out of him through immense, focused, forced internal pressure. "The address is the one I left on the stone, next to the water-filled vase. 2 blocks on the left of this street, now." The words were complete, coherent, yet utterly terrified, a monotone of deep, physical, intense exhaustion. Fear hit me immediately. 2 blocks on the left were the colossal, gated, ancient, white oak family cemetery, a massive Victorian labyrinth of ancient stone and monumental marble dating back 100 years to the founding of the city. I was delivering my single, silent, rich fare to the one place in the entire downtown area where the living did not want to go after dark. The final destination was entirely wrong. Even my rational mind could not accept a drop-off at a closed, locked cemetery at 4:30 a.m. in a life-threatening storm. I immediately turned the ignition off, refusing to drive any further, keeping my full concentration entirely fixed on the wet street in front of me. I looked at the fare in the rearview mirror. His head was perfectly still, his suit utterly dry and immaculate, covered in the massive, powerful, cold lily perfume. But he was doing one precise, terrifying action. He was staring directly into the mirror with one constant, perfectly wide-open human eye, an unnerving orb that was completely devoid of moisture, completely devoid of blinks, fully fixed onto my reflection, waiting for my compliance. I couldn't move. The man, seeing my lack of movement, now opened his perfect, smooth, cold marble lips, and began to speak the horrifying final narrative of his profound loss. The voice was thinner now. It spoke a detailed, complete final accounting of the physical cause of his final death. The water was cold. I was pushed down the steps. The marble was slick. It was my wedding night. I took a hard, immense fall, and the glass tore a perfect line down my throat. The water then came up, and I was consumed by the perfect, agonizing cold, 2 years ago. The monotone confession was precise, terrifying, and calm. He was not a passenger. He was a walking, talking corpse who was now using the final minutes of the atmospheric event to communicate a final memory to a witness. I hit the small panic button under the main dashboard and instantly unlocked both doors, fully prepared to completely abandon the car and everything I owned to the immense blackness and the screaming rain. The passenger did not flinch, did not move, did not speak a single word of recognition of my extreme maneuver. But the interior atmosphere changed entirely. A short, massive, organized, high-frequency hiss emanated from all 4 corners of the sealed cab at once, smelling intensely of pure ammonia and raw, corrosive battery acid. The seat belt across my chest spontaneously froze with a horrible, rhythmic, metallic crunch sound, completely immobilized by a massive, contained source of external cold. The ultimate, horrifying truth was clear. The immaculately dressed man was the true final output of a freezing, lethal, water-based fall into a massive, closed water-filled grave, and he had transferred his entire concentrated lethal cold energy into the material around him. The paralysis of acid and cold had immobilized my entire chassis. The passenger, now fully aware of my locked state, only spoke one final word as I sat there, utterly useless, rigid with shock across the cold console. Drive. I hit the full gas and drove, completely blinded by the internal tears and the terrifying blackness outside the window. I drove the immense, cold, chaotic ride to the exact white marble obelisk in the center of the graveyard, right where the voice told me to park. I abandoned the car, never returning to recover the keys, wallet, or anything else I owned, running endlessly into the full power of the terrifying downpour and the intense, absolute light of the rising morning. My only final thought was the sheer, terrifying finality of the single message the final passenger passed on. The last taxi ride wasn't a choice for the dead. It was the intense, required, silent transference of the final, lethal truth of an unresolved accident to the final, necessary living witness who would drive the full distance to the cold marble grave. I never look into a car's single, silent mirror anymore. The ultimate terror is to find my exact reflection looking back at the open, unblinking eyes of the corpse who had just found immense satisfaction in my paralyzing final fear. Story 7. I work an overnight contract for an absolute relic of the industrial high plains, a single, massive, abandoned high-speed oil tanker refueling station situated exactly a half-mile from the intersection of I-90 and US 2 in the remote, desolate heart of eastern Washington state. The structure was dead, but its external system lights were paid for by a perpetual state contract. The entire station forecourt was entirely silent, cold, massive, and completely uninsulated open concrete, constantly battered by the intense, driving, chaotic rain that completely consumes the high plains at night. My single, terrifying job was twofold: security watch within the glass booth and a full audit check on the single external power source. The initial terror was absolute silence. But the real problem was on the dispensing forecourt. The long line of metal pumps, all 12 of them permanently padlocked and sealed for 6 years. Each one of them, with a single sheet of heavy black plastic stretched over its entire face, was a massive, clean silhouette against the single, sickly, consistent yellow glow of the permanent overhead light standard. I was making my 3 a.m. walkthrough, wrapped tightly in my plastic slicker, listening to the intense sonic echo of the horizontal rain, when I found the aberration. 2 pumps away from me, pump number 8, an immense, 8-foot-tall, thick metal pillar, was entirely wet. Not damp from the ambient, horizontal, driving rain, but saturated from top to bottom in a running, immense volume of clear, incredibly cold, completely unidentifiable liquid. The surface ran dark and cold, almost fully dripping onto the concrete base plate. The rest of the 12 pumps, sitting in the identical weather, were only damp. I swiped the single, slow film of cold liquid with my 2 fingers, isolating the temperature source. The liquid was utterly cold, incredibly cold, far beyond the ambient cold of the storm. The terrifying liquid was actively drawing immense, internal heat from the base metal, leaving a clean, thin, dense layer of ice forming rapidly on its thick, cold, metal nozzle head. My instinct screamed the single, correct technological conclusion. The gas tank entity was consuming, not dispensing, but concentrating, storing, and actively transferring external cold energy inside the massive metal housing. I backed away completely and instantly, abandoning all pretense of physical safety. My high-intensity security lights swept fast across the 12 massive pumps. The sheer speed of the rain prevented accurate visual confirmation. But as I walked away, retreating toward the safety of my lit and heated glass shack 50 yards away, I heard one single, terrifying, complex sound from the source. The immense, organized, rhythmic tapping noise, which was an anomaly, immediately ceased. The silence was absolute. The cold, wet, absolute sound terror was replaced by the horrific, dry, organized clacking, the precise, complex sound of a single, heavy, metal handprint smashing hard and violently onto the exterior surface of the metallic pump housing, immediately dragging its physical presence and shape down the wet, cold metal side to compress its immense physical length onto the ground in search of a specific target. The physical action was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly precise in its cold, metallic intensity. I ran the final 50 yards in absolute, high-intensity panic, throwing myself through the emergency latch of the security booth and slamming the heavy steel door locked. I immediately turned all my security monitors directly against the terror's point of contact, the huge, plate glass section of the main window facing all 12 fuel pumps. My internal safety was absolute. But here came the final terror. Directly on the exterior surface of the massive window, where I knew the physical contact of the immense, cold entity would focus, a slow, single, terrifying formation began. The outside surface of the window, totally exposed to the cold external air, began to rapidly freeze. A dense, organized, expanding sheet of thick, white ice formed immediately, perfectly centered, over the absolute core viewing area of the glass. The massive freeze radiated outward, covering the glass in a tight, unyielding, permanent film of complete cold, which made me feel that immense, overwhelming physical pressure in my full veins. My view of the exterior forecourt, my final anchor to the visual reality of the immense chaos, was annihilated entirely by the powerful, contained, organized cold that now consumed the single section of the massive window. The visual barrier had been physically completed. The terrifying ice formed in a complete, immense 5-foot diameter semicircle, instantly covering half my total visual perimeter. And in the absolute, silent, still center of the thick, white, unyielding layer of the massive freezing event, a single, perfectly inscribed, enormous, utterly precise, detailed, black sludge handprint, a massive, cold, clear, 5-digit outline of fingers, appeared in the deep middle of the ice. The handprint was immense, raw, immense, and entirely composed of the clear, slow, final, cold, organized, distilled fuel oil sludge that the eternal pump entity had perfectly preserved from the chaos. The immense print was directly exposed, looking entirely down at my own trapped body. I abandoned everything in the booth, leaving the key and the money behind. I called the supervisor, frantic, asking for a full system emergency audit of all 12 fuel pumps. The report concluded one single, organized, logical anomaly. Pump 8 was completely dry, locked, and fully functional, but its internal reservoir showed a complete negative reading on its inventory. The simple accounting was wrong. The terrifying truth of the gas tank entity was simple. It was not a hostile poltergeist. It was a massive, simple, powerful, intelligent, parasitic entity of pure, focused, cold chemical pressure that had learned only one physical action: how to fully drain all external energy from the available system to permanently sustain its immense, organized, physical internal form. And every single time its cold physical form needed external assistance, it generated a localized, aggressive signal of terror, cold, and manufactured, perfect isolation to find my single available physical energy source. Story 8. I found myself in what should have been a complete, comforting domestic silence, the perfect sanctuary after a brutal separation from my wife. My new rented house share in a small, quiet, coastal town in New England was a simple, comfortable relic from the 1950s. All cedar shingles, low ceilings, and a permanent, high humidity smell of old sea salt. The room above mine, the largest, most private second-floor bedroom, was empty, no permanent tenants for over 8 months. My ultimate peace should have been absolute, broken only by the comforting, persistent, rhythmic slap 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 of the thick, freezing coastal rain washing the shingles after deep midnight. The terror began simply, audibly, and immediately. On my second night in the small, comfortable downstairs living room, in the absolute, deep quiet, the rhythmic pulse of the rain was pierced by a massive, aggressive, chaotic slamming noise directly and continuously from the precise center of the completely empty room above my head. Not once, but a continuous, aggressive, heavy, full thrumming, gang-banging sound that defied the structural limits of the simple, civilian wood structure. It wasn't the slow, rhythmic sound of a structural settling. It was the intense, physical, violent sound of immense, organized, intentional destruction being enacted on the floorboards above me, directly, fully, and absolutely over my silent core existence. I immediately snapped and slammed on the ceiling with a powerful broom handle. The noise froze. Total, profound silence returned instantly, a single, massive, cold curtain of total sonic darkness. The silence immediately shattered again, as the chaos returned, but its physical trajectory had changed aggressively. The immense, aggressive, single slam now originated from the far, quiet corner of the entirely empty room above, immediately followed by the loud, continuous, profound noise of a long, heavy, immense physical body drag being rapidly pulled with intense friction across each individual raw floorboard, a sickening, low-frequency SCHRRRP that ended finally, terrifyingly, with a single, aggressive, deep, heavy thump right over the far wall, where the single wall safe had been previously stored. The noise was physical, total, contained, and completely, aggressively committed to absolute destruction of the simple house. This was the terrifying ritual of the apartment above the silence. My fear paralyzed my movements. Climbing the stairs to an empty place was beyond any logical sanity. I was trapped. I had completely isolated both the logical sound source, a sudden, structural fault, and the physical one, a human presence, and the entire complex still produced a constant stream of aggressive, highly personalized rhythmic sound distortion that was only focused on my single presence in the space below. Driven by the need to understand the source of the immense acoustic terror, I climbed the communal external stairs 4 flights and hammered vigorously, and without stop on the massive, heavy white rental door of apartment 4B. The simple door was entirely sealed, silent, and structurally secure, radiating cold, hostile, profound silence despite the immense chaos I had just endured only 30 feet beneath the staircase. I forced my entire body pressure against the thick wood frame, convinced I could breach the lock and end the noise's single existence. After 2 minutes of total, frantic effort, the thick door suddenly, physically gave way in its frame, unsealing instantly and completely in a massive, profound physical release of cold, intense air pressure. I fell completely into the utter blackness of the immense space, breathing in deep lungfuls of cold, static, high-voltage air. The room was totally, terrifyingly empty. Clean, dry, completely devoid of any furniture or physical object, lined with the silent, immense, static, smooth wood floors that were entirely pristine and unmarked. But as I stumbled forward, my lamp cutting the immense darkness, I saw 2 final, physical, terrifying data points right at the center of the total emptiness. First, a vast, wide, 2-foot-long, precise, chaotic scorch mark, a thick, blackened, aggressive semicircle of deeply charred, burnt wood, marred the clean white paint above the central floor. The violent, structural evidence confirmed the total aggression I had heard. Secondly, written in thick, angry, concentrated white latex paint right on the absolute center of the charred, high ceiling above me, was a massive, single, short, concise, terrifying message: "He is here." The total fear broke my human mind. I fled the empty terror immediately, throwing myself completely out of the immense, cold space of the vast, abandoned room and running hard for the nearest police station, without my coat, without my wallet, without any thought of organized survival. My terrifying final submission to the physical authority of the intense sound was complete. The final terrible revelation of the apartment above the silence was simple, terrifying, and profoundly human. The relentless, organized, aggressive sound was not the noise of a possessed item or a simple poltergeist, but the terrifying power of an aggressive, massive, organized, hostile demon, a powerful entity of immense, destructive mass that had used the intense structural isolation of the empty apartment to create a single, massive, private war space. The overwhelming rhythmic noise I had heard from the room above was not chaotic. It was the terrifying, rhythmic, full-force physical building and destruction ritual of a powerful entity completely committed to organizing and building a massive, complete, total demon fortress in the single empty space above my fragile existence, an immense, permanent, dark war room dedicated entirely to the total, final psychological collapse of the single, terrified, isolated man in the small, occupied apartment below. Story 9. Working the midnight shift on the highest floor of the massive, central, old-school steel mill in Gary, Indiana, was a form of permanent, heavy isolation. I was the senior dispatch supervisor, completely sealed in a high-intensity, glass-walled control booth 20 stories up, overlooking the sheer, sprawling, silent dark of the entire cold, endless, disused metal production floor. Most of the original 1950s metal structure had been entirely shut down, leaving a massive, dark interior space under perpetual guard. My entire shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., was based on watching for accidental fires or leaks in the disused machinery, all under the constant, deafening sonic assault of the chaotic Midwestern heavy rainstorm that incessantly rattled and battered the ancient, single-pane glass of my isolated cube. The permanent, rhythmic sound of the constant rain on the glass amplified the immense, utter silence below me. It was absolute structural peace, broken only by the dim, sickly, low yellow-green glow of the emergency lights that lined the disused floor. My structural security perimeter was total. The control booth was warm, small, and self-contained. Then, at 2:30 a.m., in the absolute core of the total silence, I went to take my temperature and looked up at the vast, high, single sheet of plate glass window that completely defined my visual perimeter against the chaos outside. I was alone, staring into the dark reflection, completely focused on the simple truth of my isolated existence. As I stared hard into the thick, dark, wet glass, the subtle terror began. The passive image in the smooth, cold surface of the massive plate glass pane was not mirroring my absolute stillness. The reflection of my entire body, my tired face, my posture, the simple clipboard I was holding, was entirely displaced. Not shifted to the left or right, but fully one single, obvious, action behind the reality of my movements. I lifted my right hand to run it across my deeply tired eyes. The reflection remained entirely still, perfectly rigid, unmoving throughout the entire 10-second physical articulation. Only after my own hand was fully back at my side did the reflection slowly, meticulously, precisely lift its entire immense right hand, placing its physical fingers on the reflected glass precisely by an entirely absent clipboard line, mirroring my original thought. I completely froze, stunned by the single, clear, obvious error of sequential perception. This is a structural problem, my rational mind screamed. I reached for the old, heavy, industrial-grade coffee flask that sat on my desk, ready to move the physical object and break the perfect mirror image in the glass. The second my fingers initiated the single sequence of motion, fully 3 inches from the final handle, the reflection's rigid left hand violently seized the massive reflected coffee flask in a perfect, aggressive, crushing grip, an absolute, unbridled action that was entirely impossible in the visual logic of the space. The man in the glass was fully rejecting my conscious physical sequence and enforcing a permanent stall on the action. The profound terror broke me. The reflection did not move. It was fully committed to its total visual denial, its eyes intensely, perfectly fixed on the precise visual point where the non-existence of the cold coffee flask still sat on the real control panel. A new element penetrated the utter silence. From right behind the massive glass, the terrifyingly audible sound of a continuous, simple, relentless hiss began, the high-pitched, steady sound of immense internal steam pressure slowly leaking from a heavily contained pipe system. The sound only intensified while I remained entirely still. The immense sound was joined immediately by a terrifying, organized, single whisper that spoke directly into the cold, compressed volume of air between my own left ear and the external speaker port of the main dispatch line. "You know the sequence is wrong, Michael. Stay here. Don't touch the line. She is still waiting for the order to fail. Don't move now. Ever." The voice was a precise, high-pitched male voice, completely dry and professional, full of eternal, intense despair and extreme structural anxiety. The reflection confirmed the final name I was being given, Michael, my own. I was now caught in a structural, organized, demonic control loop. I screamed and fled the cube-shaped sanctuary immediately, entirely abandoning my duty station and the whole vast, terrifying floor to the total silence and the terrifying control of the reflection. I didn't stop until I had reached the clean, white emergency staircase, 3 entire flights below me. The final audit found nothing wrong with the structural integrity of the main steel plant or the coffee flask that remained untouched on my desk. But the terror of the steel mill reflection was absolute, permanent, and fixed. The massive, ancient structure was entirely possessed by the soul of the long-dead, intensely professional, permanently guilty senior dispatch supervisor whose critical failure to execute safety protocols caused a mass accident 30 years prior. The immense ghost was now trapped entirely inside the single, fixed visual loop of a mirrored glass reflection, running an eternal, terrifying loop of structural denial that immediately and completely consumed the present actions of any living supervisor who dared to take his small place in the immense, structural cold of the tower's single isolated control booth. My final horror. I now look at myself 10 times in every sudden glass reflection I see, only to confirm that the terrifying and controlling dead man's eyes in the mirror are not permanently staring back at my reflection, forcing a total, simple, permanent physical failure on my real, current existence. Story 10. I took a final audit contract in Detroit's condemned industrial district. The job was to survey structural damage on a sprawling chemical refinement facility built in the 1930s. A full, immense 8-story complex rendered permanently dead by decades of intense, self-generated internal toxicity. I was entirely alone, trapped in the massive, cold, concrete-filled silence of the factory's interior, working the deep hours of the night. The immense scale of the decay dominated the atmosphere, constant, oppressive darkness, total structural isolation, and an incessant, heavy, rhythmic rain outside, washing the massive brick walls with chaotic noise. My attention was fixed entirely on an abandoned, immense sub-level lab where final stage material refinement took place, the massive, cold, metal-antile core of the building's chemical essence. Inside the immense, empty lab, a vast, complex, floor-anchored steel machine had been completely forgotten. It was enormous, half the size of my service van, and permanently encrusted with a thick, impenetrable layer of black, dry, sticky used oil and immense, solidified, toxic, acid residue. The terror began when I aimed my high-intensity light at the base. The massive, immobile steel structure was not cold. It radiated a concentrated, localized, immense heat that entirely defeated the raw cold of the surrounding concrete. The heat was focused entirely around a single, small, steel valve control panel. My terror, the single phenomenon of the midnight oil machine, started with an audible sound. From inside the immense, dead, empty machinery, a slow, low, rhythmic sucking sound began, a pronounced, long, powerful slurp that was repeated with uncanny precision at 20-second intervals. This was a massive, wet acoustic sound that entirely defied the machine's dead power line and static corrosion. As the terrifying sound continued its slow, mechanical slurp, I saw a fluid enter the immense, steel base. A thin, cold, immense stream of black fuel oil was actively and powerfully being sucked into the machinery's core drive tube from a massive, underground floor-mounted canister 3 feet away. The action was deliberate, non-negotiable, and entirely driven by the vast, silent, aggressive, living parasitic need of the dead structural steel. I was paralyzed by the sight of the self-feeding machine. I crept closer, and a strong, complex, organic smell, entirely wrong for the immense dry chemical complex, hit me with complete force. The cloying, intense, suffocating scent of child's bubblegum, mixed with the sour, terrible, coppery smell of deeply dried, oiled blood. The air around the enormous, slowly gorging, black oil-sucking machine was entirely saturated with the smell of violent, domestic trauma. The machine was feeding on the fluid and emitting a powerful acoustic and olfactory warning signal of its own living, conscious terror. I abandoned all pretense of professional engagement. I grabbed the single, 2-foot-long, heavy-duty crowbar I carried and aggressively moved toward the gigantic, metallic feeding presence. As I pulled my arm high in the air to physically smash the core injection valve and stop the massive consumption, the immense suction dropped completely into silence. The entire vast machine structure, entirely coated in black, toxic oil, instantly spun to address my single line of contact with immense, terrifying, organized speed, causing its massive, 10-ton structure to emit a loud, ringing, agonizing scarych on the polished cement floor. The machine was actively and silently looking at me with its full visual physical mass. And here came the final terror. Directly visible in the intense, high-output beam of my flashlight smeared thick over the immense center surface of its main drive unit, the final visual element of its full physical mass, a highly specific, immense, thick, oily, dark red blood print. A vast, simple, precisely formed, child-sized handprint of concentrated blood matter had been completely pressed hard into the full surface of the sticky oil. The immense, indelible visual stamp was absolutely final in its communication. And 3 agonizing, long seconds later, the incredibly dry, low, organized male whisper spoke directly and precisely from right behind my right ear. "Please, do not stop the simple mechanical feed. We need this machine. It is making her happy now." I fled the room immediately, dropping the crowbar high over my shoulder. running hard out of the immense chemical block and straight out into the massive, profound rain and white noise of the exterior chaos. I quit the job immediately. I do not touch vast, complex mechanisms anymore. The terrifying truth of the midnight oil machine was final. The massive complex structural unit was not consuming the raw petroleum on a chemical maintenance protocol, but was actively and totally possessed by a massive, malevolent, organized demonic entity that required continuous, high-volume energy delivery to feed its complex, singular, physical, terrifying project, a completely oil-saturated, warm, living, simple human body it was actively trying to physically grow inside the immense chemical lab structure for a complete, final self-embodiment. My job, and my presence, was only to provide the final organic push toward the completion of its physical mass. Story 11. Up Interstate 40 in the isolated, high, cold plateaus of the central Arizona desert, the absolute darkness is broken only by the immense, cold, constant, rhythmic downpour of massive, isolated rainstorms, the kind of environment that strips away your mind's internal defenses. I was running a long-haul contract driving specialized research equipment, my base of operations entirely confined to the small, insulated metal shell of my truck's cab as I crossed the empty Navajo Nation. My shift was all midnight driving, staring through the high-intensity beams into the heavy, constant, drumming rain that made the entire dry environment seem perpetually cold and wet. In an area of non-existent human signals, my single, old, worn FM radio provided the only comfort against that total isolation. The terror began abruptly, a single acoustic anomaly on the low end of the FM spectrum, near 90.1. I flipped my dial down one notch from the crackling Spanish church music, and the expected static noise was quickly replaced by a sudden, sustained, low-pitched drone. The sound was entirely synthesized, like a perfect, continuous, single-frequency test tone. It was incredibly loud, incredibly clear, and completely without any recognizable human origin. My hand seized on the warm dial, convinced I had somehow just tuned into a powerful, isolated military broadcast signal. The low-frequency drone was immediately superimposed with a clear, calm, incredibly dry human voice, a distinct, steady, low-volume bass monologue that was speaking a full, complex paragraph of continuous information directly into my single right ear, as if the source audio was physically generated inside the very center of my speaker panel under the sheer sound pressure of the electronic drone. The terrifying content of the voice wasn't a military code or instruction. It was my voice. Precisely mine. My natural baritone, my specific, fast cadence, even the subtle, nervous upward tick at my vocal inflection. But the content was wrong. The voice was not narrating today's thoughts. It was having a furious, internalized argument with itself over the contents of my own private journal entries. The argument was frantic, delivered in a rush of strained energy, speaking of anxieties I hadn't voiced out loud in years. No, don't mention the code. Stop talking about the dog. The dog is irrelevant. You are isolating yourself too easily, Mark. You are doing this to yourself. The terror gripped me immediately. I was listening to a clear, precise, current reflection of my total, complete internal monologue, broadcast out over a powerful radio frequency. The sheer audacity of the privacy violation was crippling. I snatched my hand from the dial as if the single piece of industrial equipment was scalding my skin. Logically, I knew it must be some incredible atmospheric trick. Temperature inversion, high-altitude static mixed with a distant broadcast. But the sound wasn't distorted, and the sentences were completely coherent, intelligent, and focused on my mind's content. My body felt immediately attacked. I sat in absolute stillness in the vibrating metal and glass cage of the van, heart hammering intensely, staring out at the blurred blackness of the thick, fast-moving rain. I pulled the small emergency receiver closer to my right ear, listening to the private mental terror. The voice, my voice, continued his monologue, moving on from private fears to a short review of my immediate circumstances. He sees the mountain. Don't look at the mountain. The code is 1782. You are going to look for the fire now. Don't go. My internal voice was now narrating a desperate, clear warning about my intentions 10 minutes into my future. I threw the metal radio handset to the floor, terrified of its utter accuracy. I drove the heavy van hard out of the pull-off, determined to escape the acoustic anomaly and find a single motel with a working television. Not 2 minutes later, driving the dark highway hard into the wall of chaotic rain, the driver's side front tire abruptly collapsed with an enormous, physical bang. I wrestled the heavy van hard to the shoulder, almost fishtailing into the black, unlit abyss of the valley 40 feet below. The van was immobilized, dead. I scrambled out into the immense, chaotic storm, shining my powerful lamp at the shattered tire. The steel wheel housing was catastrophically failed, not a simple blowout, but a linear, clean snap across the steel core itself. I called an emergency tow back to Albuquerque, leaving the broken machine and its final terrifying warning. I huddled inside the driver's cab, shaking violently, desperately avoiding contact with any of the internal wiring connected to the stereo. The tow truck arrived an hour later, a heavy, familiar 1940s model. The driver, a weathered man in a deep, dark oilskin coat, spoke to me only once, his voice cracking like dry tree branches. Bad brake. Real bad metal fatigue. You shouldn't have been listening to that nonsense, son. I looked at him, startled. He knew about the radio. He just quietly shook his head, shining his massive, red floodlight on the broken van's wreckage. He unhooked the powerful tow hook and started the immense, slow, physical labor of connecting the broken rear axle. The rhythmic clanging of the 3-foot-long, heavy-duty tow chain connecting the two massive vehicles was the only stable sound in the world, a comforting, simple, mechanical labor sound. Then, one long, terrifying, high-pitched scream cut through the sound of the rain, the horrifying noise of the massive tow chain as it violently retracted its safety mechanism for the final, violent pull. The sound ended. The towman just stood there completely silent in the intense, high-energy red glare of his own machinery, his dark, soaking oilskin coat covering his entire face. He took a single deep, loud sharp intake of frozen breath, the sound of someone just emerging from the cold lake. Then, the rhythmic sound of a familiar voice began to speak in a strange, thick, waxy bass tone right against the cab's small vent. "Don't look at the back of the tire, Mark. It's too late. The light is terrible, and the tow is needed for the broken seal you are making. You should have stayed isolated." The voice was mine again, but severely distorted by the massive external cold being pressed to the wall. I abandoned the van and the tow operator right there, running headfirst into the immense, isolated darkness of the cold desert night. The voice under the desert radio wasn't a warning about my journey. It was a sophisticated, pervasive network parasite feeding on my anxiety that knew the exact structural flaw of my vehicle, providing a terror that only spoke in cold, hard, precise, external facts. I never touched a radio again. The voice was the sound of my own inevitable systemic collapse. Story 12. The intense cold and the dense fog of the old house was what I both hated and needed. It was a massive, beautiful, crumbling Victorian house that bordered a large, silent lake in remote upstate New York, a gift from my eccentric, recently deceased aunt. I was completely isolated, attempting to convert the inherited structure into a silent, organized writing retreat, battling only the intense, natural loneliness of the complete, permanent, quiet silence. The perpetual sound of the massive, cold, aggressive, non-stop rainstorm outside washing the immense cedar shakes on the roof entirely consumed the entire world, amplifying the profound isolation I was entirely trapped in. My fear was completely localized to my single point of weakness. Because the power was erratic and the central furnace was broken, I was entirely dependent on a single, clean-burning kerosene lamp, a small, 2-foot-tall glass lantern perched precariously on a wooden desk directly in the center of the vast, silent, 2-floor library. I was writing an intense, non-fiction technical manual, and I spent 20 hours a day in its faint light, obsessed over the technical precision of its single output. The sound started a single week into my residence. The single desk lamp was burning brightly, throwing a circle of intense orange color against the deep, consuming psychological darkness of the silent, immense library. A profound, constant, rhythmic, low-frequency sloshing noise began, emanating entirely from inside the final, silent room on an antique, polished wooden stand 5 feet from my ear. A small, beautiful, single, completely transparent glass pitcher filled to the brim with clear water. The intense, low-frequency sound was relentless. The clear, persistent sound of cold, silent water being forced and sloshed rhythmically and intensely against the interior glass surface. The rhythmic, continuous slosh was a complete auditory defiance of physics. The immense, cold, polished, single piece of ornamental pitcher glassware, sitting absolutely still in the dark, contained a miniature, isolated, immense internal wave of water that was being forced continuously around its own perimeter, constantly sloshing into and over a powerful internal physical resistance. I grabbed the heavy, thick brass frame of the lantern and threw its intense light directly onto the terrifying relic. The subtle, mesmerizing motion of the terrified internal wave inside the glass pitcher froze instantly. The water inside the glass became completely, perfectly, powerfully, terrifically more distilled. No surface tension, no sign of any physical, outside motion, a massive volume of immense, heavy, motionless water that defied the local law of continuous interior vibration. My logic screamed the single, obvious truth. This object was reacting to my sudden, unexpected, intense human presence entirely, and its terrifying, physical acoustic motion was its isolated warning signal. The moment my arm began to slowly move toward the glass to simply physically disrupt the stillness, the intense, silent water inside the glass pitching snapped entirely out of its silence, exploding with such immense force that a physical wave of immense freezing water crashed hard and fast against its own glass circumference, completely defying the entire physical cohesion of its solid frame container. The massive, acoustic trauma subsided, immediately replaced by a terrified, aggressive, organizing female whisper, entirely dry and clear, emanating directly from the exact center of the immense, cold water in the glass. Don't touch the surface again. The silence is necessary for the final sleep now. The mirror is clean. The terrifying voice confirmed my terror. The spirit who had just possessed the glass was fighting a complete, singular, eternal war to actively maintain the entire single structural surface tension of the water's quiet, reflective, immense surface power. The terror was pure and psychological. I had only to touch the surface to break its full, psychological concentration. I retreated entirely, grabbing a thick, raw cotton towel, covering the entire immense body of the beautiful, powerful, dangerous artifact. The profound physical cold it radiated was immediately absorbed by the mass of my defense, intensifying the immense heat of its presence in the absolute silent atmosphere. I quit the writing job immediately. The house was not merely haunted. The beautiful, dangerous piece of antique glass was a complete, powerful external psychic storage container, engineered entirely to preserve and contain the profound, immense, permanent, suicidal terror of its original owner, my aunt, at the exact single point of her emotional collapse. The persistent, internal wave motion was the terrified physical manifestation of her own mind's continuous, total, internal chaos fighting for release. The profound simple rule of logic was now absolute. My aunt had not wanted her tortured internal soul to physically escape. The immense, aggressive cold of the relentless external rain outside simply offered the single, intense, external vibrational and physical energy source needed to fuel her terrifying psychological distress, amplifying the intensity of her single, emotional water wave. My final single horror, the complete, total, quiet silence of the immense library was not a sanctuary. It was the vast, silent, simple-minded, immensely powerful acoustic microphone for a single, small, transparent glass vessel, permanently waiting for a terrifying voice to emerge from its surface tension-bound world.